Over the past 24, 48 hours, there's been a significant escalation in Hezbollah attacks along the northern border. Are we going into war? I'll have details coming up on In Focus. On Sunday, 20 Israelis were injured in two separate Hezbollah attacks along the northern border. There were 13 civilians who were wounded, 2 critically, 1 fatality on a Israel Electric Company truck that was going to fix electrical lines along the border. And then in a separate attack at the community of Manara, 7 IDF forces were killed by a Hezbollah volley of anti-tank missiles. And we've seen over the past several hours of Monday that Hezbollah is continuing to step up its aggression against Israel down by the Gulf of Haifa and what are called the Krayot, and in other areas on the western edge of the Lebanon border with Israel. So there's a real question about what does this escalation mean? Are we going to open up an active front, a much more active front with Hezbollah? I should say we've been having exchanges of fire that have been slowly growing in escalation over the past 5 weeks. And it's always been a question of when, not if, but are we now imminently on the verge of a second front, a major second front that will also see ground operations by the IDF inside of Lebanon, or are we looking at something more limited? And last night, Sunday night, the Security Cabinet met, I think, according to the reports, they met almost all night to talk predominantly about what's happening along the northern border and what can be done. At the news conference by Prime Minister Netanyahu with Defense Minister Gallant and Minister Benny Gantz from the War Cabinet on Saturday night, both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant stepped up their statements about what the Lebanese could expect in case of a major Hezbollah offensive against Israel from the north. And both essentially said, if you like what you're seeing in Gaza, that's what you're going to get in Lebanon if you escalate in this war. And on the other hand, we're seeing that the Biden administration has made no effort to hide, and in fact, every effort to make clear their utter opposition to any Israeli significant engagement with Iran's Lebanese proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. They don't want Israel to take the war to Hezbollah. They want Israel to restrain its responses to this escalating Hezbollah assault on Israel. There's always been a question. You have the American naval carrier group along the border with Lebanon, and there's been a debate among Israeli experts since President Biden announced that he was sending the carrier groups, and now 2, one is in the Persian Gulf and one is in the East Mediterranean, to the area after the Hamas invasion of Israel on October 7th and the subsequent slaughter and capture of 240 Israeli hostages into Gaza. There's always been a question, why is the United States deploying such a significant level of naval presence to the region? Most people have assumed that it's in order to deter Iran and Hezbollah from attacking Israel, from attacking American forces in Syria and Iraq and in other places in the Persian Gulf and in Kuwait and in Iraq, in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, etc. Others have said that it's in order to deter Israel from attacking Lebanon or Iran because the United States wants to maintain its pre-October 7th policy of appeasing Iran by, among other things, empowering, legitimizing Hezbollah's control over Lebanon through the puppet government of Prime Minister Najib Mikati, and who is a Hezbollah puppet. So there's a big debate about what it is that these carriers are doing here. I think probably both are correct. I think that the United States wants to avoid an escalation of the war, which is reasonable enough. And so they're deterring both Israel from attacking and also hopefully deterring Iran and its proxies from attacking, except that we're seeing that the United States isn't actually deterring Iran or its proxies. We had an Iranian general actually making a statement in which he essentially laughed at the United States and presented them as sort of a joke. The spokesman involved was Amir Ali Hajizadeh. He's the commander of the aerospace force in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And we should remember that Iran has an army, and then it has the Revolutionary Guard. And the Revolutionary Guard is actually more powerful than the Iranian military. The Revolutionary Guard Navy is more powerful than the Iranian Navy, the regular Navy, and the same thing with the aerospace projects. That's all of the drones that the Iranians are producing and even selling and exporting to the Russian forces in Ukraine. So they have the head of their aerospace command, Amir Ali Hajizadeh. And one more thing about the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So the difference between that force and the Iranian military is that the Revolutionary Guard's purpose is twofold. It's to protect the regime, and it's to export the Islamic Revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini from 1979. So they're both responsible for persecuting and oppressing and repressing rebellion at home by the Iranian people who desperately want to get rid of this regime, and they're also responsible for maintaining, expanding, and operating Iran's worldwide web of terrorist organizations from Hezbollah and Hamas, Islamic Jihad. In Afghanistan, they were sponsoring the Taliban. They have sponsored Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in general. Obviously, Bashar Assad in Syria, the regime there, and his forces and Iranian-sponsored militia in Syria and in that's another puppet of the IRGC. The Houthi regime that has declared war on Israel is another Iranian asset. So the IRGC is responsible for Iran's external aggression, its regional aggression, and the major international terrorist attacks that it's carried out over the decades, whether in South America and Argentina or in Europe or where have you. So that's what the purpose of the IRGC is. And so this very senior general in the IRGC, who's responsible for their aerospace force, said of the Americans, in their communications, Americans do not pose a threat to Iran. On occasions, they have engaged in up to 3 rounds of correspondence with Iran in a single night. And all these exchanges are characterized by language that conveys desires and requests rather than demands or threats. So the United States, he claims, is turning to Iran in a plaintive tone of voice and requesting, petitioning the Iranian regime for cooperation, to act in certain ways, but that the United States is not coming to them with threats. And this seems to be backed up by the U.S.'s actual policies towards Iran, where they're continuing to not enforce U.S. economic sanctions on Iran's oil exports and Iran's operation of this terror nexus in the regime and against the United States and U.S. forces, which we'll get to in a second. So he says that the language of the U.S. Correspondence with Iran conveys desires and requests rather than demands or threats. He added, actually, Iran is not in a position where anybody would seek to threaten it. As we are currently at the peak of our military threats, the United States is not threatening Iran. And then regarding specifically the war against Israel and the expansion of the conflict in the region, Hajizadeh said, today we can see that the war has expanded, with Lebanon being embroiled in it. The conflict may grow in scale later. The future is vague, though Iran is prepared for all conditions. In other words, Iran, which controls Hezbollah and Hamas and etc., they back the escalation and they're actually seeking it. And they're not deterred by the United States. So the question of what the American naval craft in the Eastern Mediterranean and in this Persian Gulf are doing, well, the Iranians are saying that they're not deterring Iran. Okay, so that's an important piece of information to have. And it's true, it could be propaganda, but we have to bear in mind a couple of things, that since October 7th, Iranian proxies have attacked U.S. forces in Iraq and in Syria, but particularly in Iraq, over 40 times. Over 40 times. The U.S. just lost, I think, 4 soldiers in a helicopter crash yesterday. The Pentagon are saying that this is an accident. But the U.S. has casualties. They have wounded in the region that are being attacked by Iranian proxies, first and foremost from Iraq. And the United States has not attacked once against Iranian assets in Iraq. It hasn't gone against these Iranian-controlled militias in Iraq since October 7th. Instead, they're directing their fire, and in a very limited way, on these Iranian assets, these Iranian militia inside of Syria, so that the United States is deflecting the conflict into a more permissive environment for attacking, which has always been Syria rather than Iraq, which is closer to to Iran and also, I guess, more politically sensitive. So the United States is very much restraining its fire in its defensive operations, and there's been a widespread expression of frustration by U.S. forces who are talking to American journalists who are speaking to them in the region. So, and here is Iran saying, we seek escalation. We see on the ground that Hezbollah is escalating. And this brings us to Israel's quandary. You know, one of the reasons that Israelis were so surprised, and I don't know, the military, obviously, it was a big failure in intelligence and in readiness and in general in interpreting the threat environment that we were facing from Gaza and from Hamas, which obviously we're going to have to look into very deeply after this war is over. But one of the reasons that we were caught off guard is because we always expected for an invasion force to come from Lebanon, because already back in 2018, I think we've spoken about this in previous episodes of the show, the Hezbollah published their blueprint for war with Israel, which involves the invasion of the Galilee by Hezbollah forces from Lebanon. And specifically, the task has been detailed to a unit in Hezbollah's terror army called the Radwan Brigade. Radwan Brigade is comprised of veterans of the wars of Iraq, of Afghanistan, and of Syria. They're hardened veterans, they're hardened killers, and they're a formidable force, extremely well armed, and they're right at the border. So a lot of people talk a lot about UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that was supposed to set the ceasefire, detail the ceasefire after the 2006 war, what we call the Second Lebanon War, but it was really Israel's first war with Iran, fought by Iran's Lebanese foreign legion Hezbollah in 2006. So the ceasefire that was set out in 1701 stipulated that the UN force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, was supposed to, together with the Lebanese army, were supposed to be the only military forces in South Lebanon along the border with Israel. So what Hezbollah did was, which people like myself warned at the time during the war, this was a stupid resolution, because Hezbollah always controlled the Lebanon armed forces. The LAF, the Lebanese armed forces, gave Hezbollah forces in 2006 targeting information against the IDF. So this is a joke to think that they aren't Hezbollah, they are. But also the UN force along the border is completely beholden to Hezbollah. I mean, they killed, I think, 2 of their soldiers early on after 2006, and that was the end of that. The UN began just sort of coordinating all of its sorties with Hezbollah before they went out in order to protect their personnel, because why would they want to die for this? So this is, it's all a joke. These UN peacekeeping forces anyway are a joke. But so 1701 stipulated that only this Lebanese armed force and UNIFIL were supposed to be operating along the border, but that never happened. And so what happened instead is that we have these Radwan forces from the Radwan Brigade that are arrayed across the borderline with Israel, and they're an invasion force. Okay, so pre-October 7th, Israel's planning was how to engage, or I hope anyway, with that invasion scenario, much less so from Gaza. But they're still there. They're still there, which is why almost immediately after October 7th, not only did we evacuate the civilian population from the border zone with Gaza, we evacuated the civilian population from the border with Lebanon, including the city of Kiryat Shmona, because it's just too dangerous for civilians to be there when we still have the Rod 1 force and we're in this war. So they're all in hotels, south. And the thing is that they're not going to be able to go home so long as this threat exists and is deployed across the border. I mean, after what we experienced on October 7th, there's literally no way that Israel can expect that the Israeli farmers in Metula and Manara, Kfar Giladi, Kiryat Shmona, etc., none of them are going to be able to go home. It's too dangerous. It's just too dangerous. You can't have a force like the Rod 1 Brigade from Hezbollah along the border after what happened on October 7th. So that means that we are going to have to do something in order to push them away, because otherwise Jews are just not going to be able to live there. And what people are talking about now, and I think reasonably, is that we're going to have to do a ground maneuver in South Lebanon. Like, there's really no way to avoid it. Not only are we going to have to do that, we're going to have to push everybody north of Litani River. The Litani River is a natural barrier between Israel and Lebanon that's 30 kilometers inside of Lebanese territory away from the Israeli border. So this is the border between Israel and Lebanon, and then 30 kilometers up inside of Lebanon, that's the Litani River. And the idea is that this area has to be a buffer where you can have no military forces. The only way that we're going to be able to enable Jews to live along the border is if we can keep the border area clean. So that puts us on a collision course with the United States, because the Biden administration doesn't want Israel to do anything, essentially, except maybe shoot a couple of artillery shells across the border when we're directly under attack, maybe take out terrorists who are trying to infiltrate. We've had also a lot of penetrations of Israel by terrorists since October 7th along the Lebanese border. So they want, maybe you can shoot them when they're still in Lebanon so that they don't cross the border, but they have to really be at the border zone. And last week on Tuesday, Amos Hochstein, who is the Biden advisor who negotiated the maritime borders agreement that the Biden administration of President Biden forced down Israel's throat when we had the interim government led by Yair Lapid, and he forced us to agree to this maritime border agreement with Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon that surrendered to all of Hezbollah's illegal demands for Israeli territorial and economic waters and a natural gas deposit that Israel has a sovereign claim to in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so Amos Hochstein was Biden's energy advisor who forced this deal down Israel's throat, and he's considered to be very friendly with Hezbollah. It was Hezbollah strawmen or whatever, or representatives that he negotiated that deal with. First and foremost, the man who was then head of Lebanese intelligence, which is funded by the United States and serves Hezbollah, a man named Abbas Ibrahim. And Abbas Ibrahim, he reached retirement age. He left after the deal was closed. He's been brought back from retirement, and he met with Hochstein last Tuesday. There was some talk it maybe for a hostage deal that would be negotiated through Iran, Hezbollah, and I don't know that went anywhere. We haven't gotten any hostage deals so far, but so the Americans are actively trying to pursue this idea of appeasement of Hezbollah, keeping them out of the war. They continue to fund the salaries of Lebanese military and of the Lebanese intelligence services that are, again, completely subordinate to Hezbollah. And Israel is faced with this quandary that after October 7th, we can't exercise our sovereignty over northern Israel in the sense that civilian life can continue there without having a ground maneuver in Lebanon that's going to push Hezbollah forces at least 30 kilometers away from the border. So where does this thing stand now? So I think what the government is saying, it's like, we're not in a hurry to go into war. As you guys all know, we're in the thick of things in Gaza. We have Hamas's command and control center located in their bunkers underneath Shifa Hospital surrounded, but we're kind of waiting to evacuate the wounded or the dead, or the patients from Shifa Hospital to hospitals down in southern Gaza so that IDF forces can go in and take out Hamas's command and control center. And it's a very, very dangerous, hairy moment in Gaza. So we'd like to, from what I understand, Israel wants to get more control on the ground, things more stabilized in Gaza before we start committing a very large number of forces to the Lebanese theater. I don't know that we're going to be able to have that maneuver because right now, the escalation seems to be in Hezbollah's hand, which is not a good place for it to be. And but I think that the rising casualty count and the lethality and the number of projectiles that keeps increasing from Hezbollah's side of the border is placing more and more pressure on the government. You hear more and more voices from inside of the IDF saying we can't be restraining ourselves in the face of this aggression. This is very dangerous to the forces. They can't be sitting ducks. It's very dangerous, as we saw, to civilians who have to come in and service the area. We can't have a situation like this continue. So the pressure from on the ground is building on the government. The government recognizes that things have to be done along the border with with Lebanon, in order to enable civilians to come home and to survive, and that Hezbollah's force is very, very powerful. They've built up a formidable military machine. And I'll just finish by mentioning that they have 150,000 rockets, missiles, all facing Israel. Some of them have extremely heavy payloads, and they're precision guided so that they can hit Israeli military targets. It's going to stress all of our missile defense systems. So, we have to be able to take the war to their side of the border as quickly as possible, and of course avoid a ground invasion of our territory. So this is a very hairy, much more difficult military threat that we're facing in the north, which is why we've avoided having to deal with it all of these years. But it's becoming unavoidable, as is the open clash with the Biden administration. So I think it's very important to get the information out. Iran is laughing at the United States. They're attacking U.S. forces with their proxy forces and threatening an open confrontation with the United States, which they insist they don't fear. The United States is not responding forcefully to these threats and to the actual attacks on U.S. forces in Syria and in Iraq. Instead, it's demanding that Israel restrain itself in the face of escalating assaults on our civilians and on our soldiers along the border, and also placing increasing public pressure on Israel not to defeat Hamas in Gaza. So we're seeing, we talked about this last week, we're seeing the United States very openly parting company with its positions on Israel's war and not supporting an Israeli victory. So this is really a disturbing time right now. But I think that, the ground is going to dictate the responses. And that's what we're seeing from Lebanon. That's what we're seeing with the attacks on U.S. forces. That's what we're seeing on the lack of restraint that Iran is exercising over its proxies and also expressing in its own protestation. So, one side is escalating. The other side is split between Israel that understands the need to defeat these forces in the United States, that's still parrying and thinks that it's possible to stand down and pretend none of this is important. So that's what we're facing right now, and it's important to keep our eyes on what's happening on the ground and recognize what's at stake, so that hopefully our leaders will be maybe making the right decisions and not making mistakes while we're facing this increasingly dangerous and escalatory trend in the situation here. So that's my thoughts for now, and we'll revisit this space later in this week and see how things progress on this and other fronts. So take care and keep your eyes on this channel, and we'll see you soon. Take care.